Mesdames et messieurs, je vais vous demander de prendre place. Donc, je vous remercie tous d'être dans cette très belle salle. J'ai l'honneur de pouvoir présider le panel de clôture de la Société européenne de droit international. Je voudrais dire que je suis très heureuse d'être ici ce matin, et cela à un double titre, à la fois comme membre de la Société européenne et comme ancienne présidente de la Société européenne. Et je suis très contente de retrouver la Société qui est si vibrante. Et je remercie tous ses membres et les présidents. Je voudrais aussi dire que je suis très attachée à l'université Aix-Marseille, puisque j'y enseigne depuis de nombreuses années et que j'ai beaucoup d'amis de collaborateurs, chercheurs avec lesquels je travaille dans cette magnifique université. Alors aujourd'hui, ce matin, nous allons clore la conférence dédiée à un thème qui, je pense, reste encore un peu énigmatique. Et nous avons le grand privilège d'avoir pour discuter du thème même de la conférence et de ses contours. Nous avons le privilège d'avoir trois professeurs connus qui ont beaucoup réfléchi sur différentes notions du droit international. Et je vous propose que nous engagions une conversation avec ces trois professeurs, chercheurs. Je leur demanderai à chacun de faire une intervention qui leur permettra de faire un peu un état des lieux de ce qu'ils ont entendu pendant ces 2 jours et demi à Aix. Et puis ensuite, nous aurons un échange entre les intervenants sur différents propos, différents thèmes. Alors pour commencer, je vais demander à Mathias Forteau, qui est professeur à l'université Paris-Nanterre et qui est membre de la Commission du droit international des Nations Unies, de s'exprimer. Et dans ce contexte, je pense qu'il reste, j'allais dire, des zones d'ombre sur la notion du langage utilisé pour se référer à la question de la fairness ou de l'équité ou encore de la justice ou de l'impartialité, puisque ce sont différents thèmes qui ont été utilisés de manière abondante lors de cette conférence. Donc sur le langage, le signifié, le signifiant, je donne la parole à Mathias.
Merci beaucoup, chère Laurence, et bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je souhaiterais évidemment commencer par remercier très chaleureusement les organisateurs et les organisatrices de cette très belle conférence, pour les remercier pour leur invitation, les remercier également pour leur formidable accueil à Aix-en-Provence, et puis également remercier les différents panélistes pour la richesse de leur présentation et également la richesse des débats. What I would like to do this morning is to present not concluding observations, but rather concluding questions, and maybe innocent, not so innocent questions on the topic of the conference. And as I tried to attend as many panels as possible, it was not possible to be everywhere, so my apologies if some of my observations do not reflect accurately what was said in the panels, was not able to attend. After 3 days of conference, I have two feelings. The first one is that there was a lot of empathy for fairness, which I can understand. But I think that to address in a fair manner the topic of the conference, somebody has to play the role of the devil advocate. And I volunteer to do that. And I will try to see to what extent fairness is really important for international law and what is really the value of fairness in relation to international law. My second feeling is that, with some exceptions, the topic of the conference was not addressed, in fact, and it was another topic which was addressed by many panelists, and I think maybe for good reasons, but I will try to explain. So let's start with the title of the conference, which was Is International Law Fair?, which was thus about the fairness of international law. And when I arrived in Aix a few days ago, I was expecting to see a lot of lively debates, intellectual battles, intellectual fights, clashes, people slamming the door, etc. And in fact, to my surprise, it was very polite, very peaceful, very civilized, as if, in fact, globally speaking, international law was fine. Okay, you may have some very specific problem, but by and large, international law is fair. And I was expecting, in fact, to have discussions on very important issues like migration, inclusivity, imperialism, double standards, lack of democracy, for instance, or maybe also discussions to assess to what extent Europe's practice of international law is fair or unfair to the rest of the world. And in fact, we did not have this kind, I think, of debates during these 3 days of conferences. And it may be for good reasons. Why? Because as an individual, as a citizen, I can challenge the fairness of international law. And personally, I think that international law is pretty unfair. And I think that French law is pretty unfair for many, many reasons. But we are here as lawyers. And the question is it for lawyers to address the questions of the fairness of international law? And we may have strong doubts about this for many reasons. First, there is a kind of tautology in the title of the conference, because if fairness is part of international law, there is no meaning in the questions, is international law fair? Because it's already incorporated in international law. On the other hand, if you confront international law to fairness, it means that it's not a legal question to be addressed under international law. This is a philosophical question, a sociological question, but it's not a matter to be addressed by the lawyer under international law. And I think there is a big issue here regarding in which capacity we as lawyers, we can address the fairness of international law. I would maybe go even beyond that. Why should even we as lawyers be concerned with the fairness of international law? You all know the Latin adage, dura lex, sed lex. So why should we care with fairness of international law? Law is what it is, full stop. There is also maybe some danger in introducing the concept of fairness in relation to international law. What does it mean? Does it mean that you can challenge existing treaties by claiming that they are unfair, but then you do not apply the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which has specific grounds to challenge the validity of treaty? So there is maybe some risk to introduce this discussion of fairness of international law. There is also the risk to create false expectations for people. If you tell people, look, you can challenge the fairness of international, but then there is no result under international law if you do it. So I think fairness is something that needs to be challenged in and by itself to decide what role it can play when you assess the existing international law. In any case, is it feasible to assess the fairness of international law? Can we do it in the abstract? I think it's very difficult, and you have to go question by question, topic by topic, problem by problem to assess in a given topic if international law is fair and unfair. And you need to have specific data to do it. It's a very complicated issue. We need granularity in assessing the fairness of international law. And then you can ask, is it very different from what we do on a day-to-day basis as lawyers when you assess the merits, the pros and cons of a specific rule, a specific judgment, a specific law, etc.? Is it very different when you invoke fairness? And again, if we go beyond that, is it not too reductionist to invoke fairness? Fairness cannot be used alone. You have to confront fairness to legal security, to legal stability, for instance. You have to foresee the consequences of the decisions or the judgments, etc. So I think the focus on fairness is, of course, very useful to assess international law, but it cannot be done alone. You need to incorporate other elements to challenge the existing international law. If you want to seriously assess the fairness of international law, then you also need to have a precise definition of fairness. And as a French speaker lawyer, I must say that I'm not sure that I understand clearly what is fairness, which is a very English-speaking, very connoted English-speaking concept. In a word, is it fair to discuss fairness only in English? And to some extent in French, but I heard equity, proportionality, which is not exactly fairness. What about Chinese language, Russian language, Spanish language? I think there is here an issue. If you want to be fair, you need to be inclusive at the international level, and you need to think with regard to different legal cultures. And I have the feeling that fairness is maybe too common law oriented. And lastly, you need to have a legal basis to discuss fairness in relation to international law. To confront international to fairness, is there any rule, general rule of international law, which obliges international law to be fair? And I think this is very difficult to find such a rule. And it has been said that even in EU law, there is no general principle of fairness. So it seems to be that fairness is not a legal concept. It's something which is outside international law. With maybe one exception, which was not, I think, quoted during the debates, which is Article 13 of the UN Charter. Article 13 of the UN Charter mandates the UN General Assembly to encourage the progressive development of international law. So there is a UN mandate to change international law progressively. But I'm not sure that to progressively develop international law is exactly the same thing as fairness of international law. So these elements may explain why most of the speakers, in fact, deal with another topic, not the fairness of international law, but fairness in international law. And I think this is something very different. And here, as lawyers, I think that we are on safe ground. We are on safe ground because we have some guidance coming, for instance, from the ICJ, the judgment of 1986, in Burkina Mali, paragraph 28 of the judgment of the court, where the court described the role of equity in international law, not equity of international law, but equity in international law. And the court said that you can use equity not infra legem, not praeter legem, but only infra legem. And the court said that equity is something which is a method of interpretation of the law in force and is one of its attributes. It is a matter of finding an equitable solution derived from the applicable law. So fairness, equity comes within international law and not against international law. But what is, I think, quite new in international law in the last 10 or 15 years is the increasing reference to fairness, equity, etc. in specific rules of international law. And we heard a lot of that during the presentation, and I can quote a few examples. The notion of climate justice, which will be at the core of the pleadings of states before the ITLOS and the ICJ, and I think it is now part of international law, climate justice. Equitable principles in compensation in the law of self-responsibility. Take a look to the DRC Uganda case of 2022. Or the very interesting Article 7 of the BBNJ agreement, which makes a list of a number of principles and approaches, and you find in this list the principle of equity, which is now part of a binding treaty, a future binding treaty in international law. And I think this is a trend which is very, very interesting. But then this trend raises a number of questions, and two main questions. First, what does it tell us about international law? And what does it tell us about the way of teaching international law? What are the skills of international lawyers today when they have to apply rules which refer to equity, to fairness, etc.? I think the way we were taught international law 20 or 25 years ago is no longer relevant. You need to develop new skills to interpret these rules of international law. And then the second question is it a good evolution for international law? Why this question? Because there is a shift of powers in international law. From the formation of international law, where you decide to adopt a rule which is fair, from the enforcement of international law. This is when you apply international law that you have to assess the fairness of the solution. So there is a shift between the legislator, from the legislator to the adjudicator. And we may ask, is it a good outcome to have judges deciding on what is fair in a given situation? Is it not for states or for people to decide on this issue? So it's not so obvious to me that fairness is a very beautiful concept that we all must love very much. It triggers a number of questions. A very last remark. The title of the conference was very static. Is international law fair? I think that the real issue is how we proceed as a lawyer to have more fairness in international law. What are the legal tools that we can use? How can we proceed to improve the fairness of international law? But maybe we can discuss this during the Q&A, if there is a Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathias. Now going to turn to Surabhi Ranganathan, who is a professor at Cambridge University, and she's now going to address a topic that has also been floating around during the conference, which is are there different registers when you speak in terms of fairness, and does it depend on where you're sitting?
Thank you. So, in a closing session, after 3 days of a very vibrant conference, what do you say? First of all, of course, you say thank you. Thank you to the organizers for putting together a stimulating program and for your generous hospitality. Thank you also to all of you for your papers, for your questions, for all the conversations. However we may theorize it, in the moments that are far-flung, invisible, or divisible, or cringy, college comes together, it's undeniably a lot of fun. And of course, thank you to this panel, to Laurence, to Mathias, to Fuad. Okay, so what do you say next? And this is, of course, the daunting bit. I wondered, when I was invited to this panel, how should I think about it? What is the role of a closing session? We do know, in some sense, what an opening session might do for a conference in terms of introducing questions and ideas and announcing expectations for us to collectively reflect upon for the duration of the meeting. And indeed, our opening sessions did do that, not least in examining the main question. The conference theme is International Law Fair, and in considering the further questions that it could generate. Now, I start here because I too, when I read the theme, wondered about the ways in which it could be answered, would be answered at this conference. It seemed to me, when I was just speculating at home, that the answers would come not simply as yes or no, but as variations on two themes. Anne Offord, of course, told us about 12 ways in which the question could be answered, but my speculations were more idle than that, so I only came up with two. I thought we'd get, on the one hand, some versions of, look, it's impossible to say that international law is fair per se or unfair per se, because then we would have to first pinpoint exactly what those things are, and of course there is no common agreement on that. However, we can say that international law carries within it the promise or the ingredients of fairness, whether that is in the form of its improving process, its expanding community, or in its very quality as law, and thus encased within a culture of formalism, in which things like opposability and generalizability and so on are so important. So we would have, in short, versions of the answer that international law has its shortcomings, but can you imagine where we would be without some principal commitment to an idea of legality that is distinct from pure politics or pure morality? On the other hand, I thought we would get versions of the answer that would be, no, of course not. International law is not fair. No one looking around the world as it is and noticing the inequality, the violence, the impending sense of climate disaster, and knowing something about history, about colonialism and capitalism and international law's historical role in the expansion of both, and in its ongoing complicities in the reproduction of the same logics and patterns today, could possibly say international law is fair. In fact, we should ask ourselves rather what happens to impulses of fairness in the form of movements for redistribution or reparations or justice when they meet the structures and the limiting criteria of international law. And look, I'm not producing this typology in a facetious way at all, because if you were to ask me the question, is international law fair, I would probably give you answers that would rotate between these poles. And as it turns out, we did get versions of this in this conference, but we also got many other answers that included the unqualified, yes, international law is fair, that included perceptive readings of how notions of fairness are themselves formed or transformed through lawmaking and dispute settlement, answers that included refusals of the question of fairness, answers that included careful readings of the company that the word fair or fairness keeps. Where do we encounter the letter of fairness, and what does that say about its spirit? So rather than synthesize all this, let me just use my remaining minutes to speak to one kind of classification that I thought was made and challenged repeatedly at this meeting. This classification was between disruptive or radical fairness on the one hand and constructive or incremental fairness on the other. These forms of fairness, it was argued, posed different kinds of questions for the international legal system and hence could not be treated the same way. Looming over these assertions was the figure explicitly invoked so many times, Tom Frank, teacher and mentor to so many of us. Many people recalled Frank's book on fairness, and famously, Frank began his inquiry on the assertion that it was a particular configuration of circumstances which even allowed the question of fairness to be asked. It was when international law had entered its post-ontological era that we could stop defending the international legal system and look into the matter of its fairness. And this has a particular effect, he noted, on our inquiries. Instead of simply advocating for the incorporation of fairness, we had to acknowledge the value of the system itself and thus think about the differences between incremental and radical fairness. Incremental fairness was fairness already sort of founded within the law, equity within the law, and similar doctrines, and was thus relatively easy for the system. The system had many routes, judicial and legislative, for its incorporation. Thus, the installation in short order and already decades ago of concepts like unjust enrichment, restitution, estoppel, etc., as general principles of international law. Frank suggested, I think, but only just, that in its more confident post-ontological phase, this form of dynamism could continue and perhaps even slightly expand its work on international law. The real question, though, was about radical fairness. This, Frank noted, was historically much more difficult to incorporate. Judicial processes were neither able nor appropriate to do it. Legislative pushes were needed, and quite frankly, even if such a legislative push was forthcoming, it could be so system-threatening that it had to be either molded into something more acceptable or excluded altogether, thus the fate of the NIEO and so forth. And Frank is rather accepting of this fact. For him, this is the cost of multilateralism, this is the cost of the international legal system, of following process, and ultimately, he says, process is important to allow the system both to remain open to different ideas of fairness that might emerge over time, and remain capable of vetting and absorbing these ideas on its own terms. Here, Frank is recognizably, I think, placing himself within a venerable Anglo-American liberal and constructivist tradition of thinking about international law. And for many people, perhaps this is intuitively right. But there has been pushback. And where did the pushback come from? So here, I won't point to particular conference speeches just because everybody has gone to different rooms, but rather I'll speak to one text that is accessible to all of us, in which we can see the counter to this typology between disruptive and radical and constructive fairness. And this comes in Anthony Anghie's recent ESIL forward. In that forward, it does many things, but one of the things Anghie does is bring into the question this idea that the distinction between the radical and the incremental is what is telling in what the system absorbs and what it does not. As he points out in his discussion on reparations, that while certain reparations claims, such as for colonialism and slavery, were indeed opposed and remain opposed as too disruptive, there has been a remarkably radical law of reparations that has crystallized extremely rapidly in the opposite direction, without anyone regarding that as system threatening. He talks precisely about doctrines such as unjust enrichment, which he says were articulated in a particular context, in the context of protecting corporations, colonial corporations, from the nationalizing moves of newly independent states. The law of investment protection is proof for Anghie of international law's capacity to be dynamic, but perhaps only in particular directions. I could go on here a bit in drawing out this point and all that it implies for international law and possibilities of fairness. But keeping time in mind, let me close by saying how this work by Anghie speaks to and was reflected in what I saw as one major thread in this conference, and that was, across many panels, the call to form better knowledge. What we see from Anghie is that radical and incremental fairness, constructive and destructive fairness, these are just labels. They are matters of perception and thus demand attention to how we perceive things and how that is shaped by who we are. These questions of epistemology and of our own material positions that speak to our epistemologies have not only come up in this conference, but also productively in ways that make it clear that the usual stylized answers will no longer do. It is not that these old differences between developed and developing states, global north, global south, etc., no longer matter. Of course they do. But we heard, I think, important calls to expand our schema, to disaggregate the schema, to think more carefully, to read more carefully, to know the world more deeply, more attentively, more urgently, and more self-reflectively, such that even our abstractions, and international law is a discipline hopelessly committed to abstraction that's built into the fabric of generalizability and opposability and so forth, but such that even our abstractions are based on fuller concepts of the material and social relations that make up the world and in which we are ourselves steeped. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Surabhi. We're now going to turn to the third speaker, who is Fuad Zarbiyev, who is a professor at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And Fuad, I think you're going to speak about the structure of international law and the issue of fairness.
Merci Laurence, c'est un plaisir d'être dans ce panel avec vous tous. Je veux aussi saisir l'occasion pour remercier les organisatrices et les organisateurs qui ont fait un magnifique travail. Je sais à quel point il est difficile d'organiser un événement de cette ampleur. Il est encore plus difficile de l'organiser bien. Donc vraiment un grand bravo. I would have loved to continue in French, but I assume it's only fair to use a language that is shared with the audience, and I suspect that's English rather than French. When I got the invitation to be part of this panel, I was as puzzled as Surabhi, actually. I didn't have the first clue as to what I could possibly say. Not because I don't have anything to say about fairness or international law, or fairness in international law, but because I thought that the fairness is not the kind of topic, as Mathias actually insightfully suggested, that easily lends itself to concluding remarks. I am not a nominalist, philosophically speaking, at least not all the time. But I am of the view that it's very difficult to say anything both generally valid and reasonably meaningful about fairness in the abstract. I suspect that is what Yves Daudet and Andrea Bianchi meant in the inaugural panel when they said it's unlikely that by the end of the conference we would have a response to the question that is articulated in the title of this conference. But I have to say something. I don't want to be kicked out of this conference, or maybe I will be, you never know, so bear with me. I will start with a general point which should be fairly uncontroversial. The title of our conference asks the question of whether international law is fair. And those of you who attended the last panel heard Anne Orford, who articulated an impressive list, very well thought out, very well structured list of 12 responses to that question. It's very difficult to come up with anything that is not captured by that framework, general framework that Anne offered. So whatever I'm going to say now is probably a way to get there from a different angle. Since I have no sense of orientation, it's going to be a long detour maybe. It took me 3 days actually to find out how to get from the hotel to the conference venue without getting lost. I think we can all agree, that's the uncontroversial part of the proposition I'm going to make, that international law is part of the world, right? And I'm not sure how many of you think that this is the world we live in is a fair world. I bet not so many. Now, is it possible? How is it possible? So, if it is so difficult to define fairness, Andrea Bianchi skillfully employed the mirror stage metaphor that Lacan introduced. I think Lacan can also be used for, can be helpful for another reason, basically his conception of ontology. So traditionally, philosophy has divided the world into two ontological categories, being and nothingness, l'être et le néant. Lacan added a third category, which he called manque à être, and it's been translated into English as lack. So lack is an interesting status, ontologically speaking. It is more than nothingness, but it's less than being. It's a placeholder. It is something that should have been there, but is not there. And I think fairness is a placeholder. It's not there. But we all have some intuitive understanding, gut feelings about it. We have instinctive knowledge about what fairness implies. Richard Rorty once used the concept of vegetarian conception of truth. It may not be politically correct these days to use that concept, but what he meant by it was we have a small t truth in a way, right? Not capital T. So basically, a mild, serviceable, everyday conception of truth we all need to be able to get around every day. And I think we have all a vegetarian conception of fairness. Basically, you know, we know it when we see it, that kind of knowledge. I can offer you a thought experiment. There is a nice passage in a novel by Don DeLillo, 0K, where a character says, half the world is redoing its kitchens, the other half is starving. Who think that's a fair situation? Or a real life example from this summer. I was surprised, maybe it came up because I wasn't able to attend all the panels. I will call it the tale of two vessels. On one vessel, 5 people died on a very expensive excursion inside a submersible called Titan to descend to the Titanic. Each of them had paid $250,000 US to visit the wreckage of Titanic. Multiple countries and private entities sent ships, planes, underwater drones in the hope to rescue them, 5 people. Just days before, some 500 people died in a boat transporting migrants that sank in the Mediterranean, and the Greek Coast Guard failed to help them. Now, the Titan drew enormous attention. It happened recently. It was in June, I think, this summer. So you know. tightened to enormous attention from news organizations worldwide, and their audience is much more than the boat that sank with 500 people. So some lives are more valuable than others, or as Judith Butler famously said, some lives are grievable and some are not. And I am fairly confident that nobody in this room thinks these are fair states of affairs, but that's the world we live in. Now, what does it tell us about international law and fairness? I would submit it tells us at least this, that international law is in a damned if you do and damned if you don't type of relationship with fairness. If the world is deeply unfair and international law has something to do with it, we've got a problem. If the world is deeply unfair and international law has nothing to do with it, then we've got a problem again. What is the point of international law if it can't do anything about the unfairness of the world? Now, I cannot address that conundrum here. We would need another dedicated conference for it. What I want to do instead is to say a few words about our responsibility as international law scholars towards fairness. I was surprised that that didn't feature, to my knowledge, again, subject to the caveat I mentioned, that hasn't featured enough in our discussions. I understand the title cannot be page long. Of course, international law, is international law fair? That's the title of the conference. But there is something misleading about it, which is it makes it sound as if international law has agency on its own. It's as if we are outsiders to it. But international law is made, interpreted, applied, operationalized, promoted, justified, legitimized by human beings, a category that includes, believe it or not, international law scholars. Now, governments are a very easy target to blame, right? But there is no government here. I want us to blame ourselves. Two, more precisely, some of our practices that produce and reproduce sites or experiences of unfairness. As Professor Lagmani beautifully put it in the inaugural panel, il y a de l'injustice produite et reproduite par l'ordre juridique international. I want to focus on our role as scholars in the production and reproduction of some of that injustice. Let me give you some examples. Some of them actually were mentioned by Surabhi, so my task is made easier. How many doctrinal constructs have been constructed over the course of the history of the discipline that have been used to perpetrate unfairness and injustice in the world? Of course, I use we generically. We should take responsibility for the history of the discipline as well. Think about the justification of colonialism. Think about the justification of the division of the world into civilizations, barbarians, and savages. From the more recent history of the discipline, think about the theory of internationalized state contracts, the doctrine of persistent objector, the concept of gouvernement international de fait, the unwilling and unable doctrine. All these doctrines, these are scholarly constructions, serve to justify domination, inequality, and all sorts of abuses. Another example, is it fair that, and I'm quoting here Professor Chimney, academia in the global north continues to set the intellectual agenda and prescribe the standards and protocols of good scholarship? This situation cannot be remedied simply by giving non-Western scholars a space or a voice. The problem is what philosopher Miranda Fricker describes as epistemic injustice. In the credibility economy of international law scholarship, scholars from Global South are given a deflated level of credibility. In other words, as Gayatri Spivak says, the question is not who is entitled to speak, but rather who should be listened to seriously. Who would deny that the right to be listened to is not equally, right to be listened to seriously is not equally distributed? And then there is what sociologist Howard Becker, who passed away recently, called a hierarchy of credibility in international legal academia. A final example, how many of us normally describe, it's an example, you can use another. Malcolm Shaw's international law textbook or Brownlee's Principles of International Law as Western approaches to international law. I bet not many. It doesn't come naturally to us. They are not Western conceptions or approaches to international law. They are international law tout court. But how many of us are easily disposed, I mean, it almost comes naturally to us, to describe a book or an article by, say, Professor Chimney, Professor Sornaraja, or Professor Makau wa Mutua, third world approaches to international law? I am fairly confident that the answer is many of us. Is it fair to grant one type of scholarly discourse which is as provincial as any other discourse, the monopoly of the universal? What fairness requires from us as scholars is to make this unfairness visible and to make clear that Malcolm Shaw is not the universal. He is a particular usurping the universal, and he's not entitled to that privilege. Universalizing any particular is an imperialistic agenda, but provincializing the universal has something to do with fairness, in my view. In sum, let's not forget that research is a political activity, whether you want it or not. What we do as scholars is part of broader power structures. As scholars of international law, we may not be in a position to change the world. As scholars of international law, we may not have the power to force the government to do anything, but there is at least something within our reach, not to be an instrument in any project of injustice or unfairness, and to use the title of a wonderful book by Luc Boltanski, Make the Reality of the World Unacceptable by Uncovering Its Unfairness. Thank you.
Thank you, Fuad. So you've heard different views, and I think there is a common thread, which is can an international lawyer, can a lawyer speak about this famous F word, fairness, and how should he or she do it, and do we have the right tools for, are we well equipped for speaking about the topic? We have several themes, but I'd like first to ask each of the panelists to react to what they've heard from their colleagues. So, Surabhi.
Great. Okay, thank you. These were great talks, and I think we are largely, actually there were themes of agreement, but maybe my reactions, I was smiling when Mathias said maybe only people who speak English can talk about fairness, because after all, what meaning does it carry in any other language? And it also, that made me think of this wonderful text by C.L.R. James. It's a book called Beyond a Boundary, which is about a book ostensibly on cricket, but it's a book on everything. And it begins with saying, you know, what do they know of cricket that only cricket know? And what he's trying to show through that book is that our ideas of the world, our ideas of fairness in the world, are inculcated through these very inchoate notions about the spirit of cricket and so forth. And so this is, you know, that we have to really, to know the world, we have to know something beyond the thing we're looking at. One could say the same for international law as well. What do they know about international law that only international law know? And so I suppose the question, and this is, I think, was also implied in what Fuad was saying, and perhaps also what you were saying yourself, is what is the international lawyer's responsibility for actually expanding their own epistemology, for constantly questioning what does it actually mean to be an international lawyer beyond knowing the rule of international law, which of course is one part of our corpus.
Thanks. Mathias?
Thank you, Laurence. And if I can just react to this question and then to part of the presentation of Fuad. On your question, I think that the answer is that the role of lawyer is not only to tell if international law is fair or not fair, is to provide solutions to this fairness. And I think that we are nowadays in a very different world. We have so many rules of international law that with the power of imagination and the power of combination, you can, in fact, find a lot of solutions to make international law more fair. I would just give you an example, which is a veto of the UN Security Council. It is unfair to have the veto, But you can use Article 41 of the Articles of the ILC on self-responsibility. In case of crimes, you have the obligation to cooperate, and maybe you can use it to paralyze the veto at the UN Security Council. So you may have solutions sometimes to address the unfairness of a given situation. And I think the role of lawyers is this one, is to provide solutions to help improve international law, and not only to be in the comfort zone to say this is unfair, this is fair, which is not very productive, in fact, in my view. On the point that Fuad made on teachings, it was something which was addressed by the ILC in August with a new draft conclusion which was adopted by the drafting committee of the ILC, which says that when you use teachings in international law, you have to use teachings coming from different legal systems, different regions of the world, and with due regard to be paid to gender and linguistic diversity. So I think there is improvement also in the diversity of materials to be used to interpret and enforce international law. So progress is here, I think.
Thank you. Fuad?
Thank you. I'm not sure actually I have much to add, but Mathias made an important point that I wanted him to maybe elaborate a little bit on. The point of basically, you know, our role is not just, you know, to point to problems, it's also to provide solutions. I mean, it may be a matter of personal temperament. I mean, the people who know me, they know that I am the last person you would go for a solution. I am the person you would go for a diagnosis, I think, at least in my scholarly capacity. But what I thought was very interesting in your talk, Mathias, was also, if I understood correctly, you sort of propose a division of labor that, unless I misunderstood, that lawyers may not be best positioned in their capacity as lawyers. I emphasize that. I think that's probably what you meant. I mean, I would like you to elaborate on it. Why is it? Is it because of some sort of intellectual limitations that come out of the profession, or does it have to do with the training we receive, or is it not also the role of lawyers? I wouldn't generalize to lawyers in general, but scholars, right, whose job is to think, right? Basically, they get paid for thinking. It's a privilege that go a little bit beyond the, let's say, the formal boundaries of the discipline and think about fairness and other broad issues of international law from other angles.
Well, it was, of course, to some extent provocative, so to have a discussion. But I think what you try to assess the fairness of international law with non-legal tools, then you need to have specific methodologies, specific training, specific readings. And I'm not sure that when we, as lawyers, address the fairness of international law, we are very faithful to these specific methodologies. So this is my fear, that we, in fact, do it as amateur, you know, and not with real skills to do it. And then I think that it's, I mean, if you do it properly, then you have to go at the end of a story. And fairness is also part of a narrative. It's a political tool. So it has a specific agenda too. So we should be as neutral as possible as lawyers regarding this concept, to be sure that we assess it in a fair manner and not in a biased manner. So it was a call for, yes, for caution.
Thank you. We're going to have a last round of changes, and then we'll close the session. I'd like to ask to Surabhi, because my impression listening to our colleagues and so on was that under the substantive fairness, or justice in French, I don't think it's a right translation for me. In fact, there are many things that you put under this cover. And I'd like to ask you, do you think that it's useful so that we can include different ways of looking at how to reform or humanize or environmentalize international law, or should we be more keen on having more precise definitions?
Sorry, just to clarify, do you mean a more precise distinction between substantive and procedural fairness? I mean, look, I think you're right. I mean, in some ways, yes and no. I think I mean, I could be completely wrong about this. This is one of the reasons why, one of those reasons why sort of forming stronger impressions of the world is important. But my sense is that this distinction is one that gets also made and unmade in the process of saying, well, this is just about procedure. This is just a question of raising, a municipal law principle to the level of international law. It doesn't impose substantive issues, whereas others are like these big substantive questions that require a certain political sort of reckoning with how we want to change the law. So I think these distinctions we must not lose sight of because they do some work, but we must also recognize that there is a way in which we also put things into these channels and already as a basis of how we want to react to particular claims. And I guess we saw that with things like state responsibility, also in between the primary and the secondary. How do we understand what is a procedural rule versus actually a substantive rule?
So it's good that there is fluidity. Now a question to Mathias, and sorry for that, but you've mentioned Article 13 of the UN Charter. You're a member of the International Law Commission. So can the International Commission speak about fairness? And does it speak about fairness, or should it speak about fairness?
Well, of course it does, but under the cover of its mandate, which is to codify and to progressively develop international law. So you have to start from what is existing under international law. But the difficulty that we have, in fact, in very practical terms, is that you can start with the idea of equity, fairness, etc., which are, I think, shared by all the members. But then you have to translate them into concrete rules. And here the problems start, because it's not an easy game to convert ideas, general ideas, into specific concrete rules, because there you have conflicting issues, conflicting goals to be combined, and it's always very difficult. And this is why, in the end, I think the work of the Commission is quite conservative. But the starting point is very generous, I think.
Thank you. And Fuad, so you've addressed a big issue for us. It's that what do we do in an unfair world which, with the structure, is not helping us very much. So I'm now becoming a firm believer in experimentation, because I think that's the only way to change things at different levels. So do you think that there are any sort of sites of experimentation for sort of changing the structure of the international law, for making it a bit more fair?
Yeah, I assume my problem with that question would be whether we have, let's say, the legitimacy that would be called for, to bring about any change, again, in our scholarly capacity. I am a big fan of a wonderful piece that Ann Orford wrote several years ago. It's called In Praise of Description in Leiden Journal of International Law, if I'm not mistaken. Basically, it's a piece largely inspired by Foucault's conception of philosophy, that our job as scholars is basically to describe. I know that in French, so the language is important, ce qu'on appelle en français travail descriptif. It would be actually it wouldn't be a compliment if your professor tells you that your work is completely descriptive. It means actually there is no thought, no analytical work in it. But what Ann Orford meant is a different type of description. I just encourage everyone to read that piece. So I think our job as scholars, and it's a quite difficult job, by the way, to describe what is, right? What the state of affairs is accurately, I think, is an important work. Now, what I would say, instead of experimentation, Laurence, I don't want to sound nihilist, as if I had put forward a nihilistic conception of fairness. I said, fairness is a placeholder as any other universals, but it doesn't mean that we cannot have a working conception of fairness. But I think what we should do as scholars in our scholarly capacity, I think it's important to show that any conception of fairness is provincial. It's not universal. Its pretension to universality should be problematized. And here I would admit, earlier I referred to Richard Rorty, who is one of my philosophical heroes. He once said, maybe he went too far, he said that my discourse is as provincial as the discourse of a Nazi, but I come from a better province. I think that's what differentiates one discourse from another. Not that one is truly or transcendentally universal, but one is better than the other. And then the whole work of argumentation should be taken care of, right? Why is it that it's better than the other? I think that's the serious responsibility of a scholar, in my view.
So with these closing remarks, I'd like to thank the European Society of International Law. It's now time for the closing session, and I would like to thank you for your attention.